coverage today. So we're broadcast live on YouTube, and then they'll use that recording to actually put it up on SCTV starting tomorrow. So it's just we had a scheduling challenge today.
Okay. Are we live now?
Coverage today.
You're all set.
Okay, very well. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today is December 15th. This is the Town Council Finance Committee meeting. Colette, are you going to be our secretary today?
I am.
Okay, could you call the roll?
I will. Okay, Councillor Clucci,
Here.
Councillor Anderson,
Here.
Councillor Gleisteen.
Here.
Nice to see everyone.
Welcome. The next item on the agenda is approval of minutes from September 15th. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? Colette, would you call the roll?
Yes. Councillor Gleisteen,
Yes.
Councillor Anderson,
Yes.
Councillor Clucci.
Yes. Okay, the next section of our agenda is really a big part of it's an organization meeting. So I wanted to go over some of the basics, what the charge is for the committee and talk about what some of our individual goals might be. And then we have some real business that we're going to go over as well, including a review of the mechanics of the purchase or potential purchase of Governor William King's Lodge. We've got an update from town staff on the budget through the first quarter, and then an update on the childcare program that is taking place at the House of Lights. So to kick it off, the second page of the agenda packet lists out our Finance Committee charge. And Liam, I don't know if you have the ability to bring that up on the screen. So I'm sure that we've all read it, and we, in some cases, many times, and you get a little different nuance every time. So I wanted to just, give us a chance to kind of let this settle in and maybe kind of say out loud what it means to us, so that we maybe have a common understanding of what our purpose is as a committee. And I'll start by reading it. So this is: the Finance Committee shall review appropriation requests and revenue estimates for all offices, agencies, and departments of the town. The Finance Committee shall meet regularly with its designated counterpart from the Town Department of Education to discuss the appropriation requests and revenue estimates from that department in accordance with Article 4 and 5 of the Town Charter. The Finance Committee shall prepare recommended line item appropriation amendments, with the exception of the Town Department of Education budget, to the proposed budget to the Town Council prior to the public hearing and final reading. The Finance Committee shall recommend only a total appropriation for the Town Department of Education, pursuant to Article 5 of the Town Charter. The Town Council retains the ultimate responsibility of reviewing and approving amendments. In consultation with the town manager and staff, the Finance Committee may prepare and recommend for approval by the Town Council policies and/or procedures relating to the financial affairs of the town. There's a lot packed in there. So a couple of the things that I think confused me initially was, what's an appropriation? And I don't know if the town staff can kind of help us understand some of these terms a little bit better, but in terms of the difference between an appropriation and an authorization, Tom or Ruth, are you able to speak to that a little bit? Or if everybody's up to speed on it, maybe we don't need to go there. But
I think in this context, appropriation could be interchangeable with expenditure.
Okay.
So it's an expense item as opposed to revenue. Ruth, you can be probably far more eloquent and conversant with GFOA linguistics than I.
The appropriation is kind of the number that a department brings forward to the Finance Committee and Council and Town Manager to determine what they believe they need to operate for the following year. And that appropriation is the word that they use, that the council then ultimately, after it's gone through the process, approves. So we may have an appropriation of $10,000 for something. That's their budget, and that's how much they can spend. So I guess that's the way I look at it. And I think
we review the request. Once it's approved, it can be spent. It's money that can be spent.
Correct. That becomes the appropriation.
And then it's my responsibility to manage within those, that appropriation. And if I can't, there is a process for a budget amendment to change that appropriation, shift money from one to another, or come up with other funding sources to change the appropriation amount. But so long as I stay within the appropriation authority granted by the council vis-a-vis the budget approval, that's my responsibility. If I can't, I need to come back and get your permission.
Now, I had a question. It comes up a little later with the budget update, but when we're moving money across departments, so let's say we're moving it from police to community services or something along those lines, does the town council need to be involved with those types of shifts?
I would say yes.
Okay.
However, within community services or public works or police, within a division, there is some movement of money within that. But I think if you're moving to other divisions, it does require a budget amendment and council action.
Okay.
Is that fair, Ruth?
Yes, I was going to say the police could make a move between their patrol and their dispatch because it all falls under police. However, if the fire department were overspent and we needed to move some money, that would require council action.
Betsy, go ahead.
So on that note, Ruth, if the police department wanted to move from office supplies to personnel or personnel to office supplies, just making up an example. So how far down, does this bucket go? Is it top line, pretty much anything once, say, police get appropriated, how much ever they get appropriated is pretty much carte blanche. They can spend anything within that, or do they have to stay within certain buckets?
They pretty much can stay. Salary is probably not a good example because once the salary is determined, it's a little more difficult to move that unless somebody were to leave and they hired someone else either for lesser pay or more pay. But generally speaking, our process is, in that case anyway, is we let the expenditures go to wherever they belong. So, if they were overspending their supply line, we would say continue to overspend your supply line. As long as you don't overspend your total budget, you should be okay. And that gives them an idea of what they need to spend next year. Maybe it's an extraordinary circumstance and it's not going to happen. Other times it could be that, they just didn't budget enough. So to that degree, we allow them to make those adjustments.
So
Yeah,
that could be,
I was just could I expand further, Betsy? Maybe it'll help you. We have line item detail for a reason. So my department heads don't have carte blanche to work within the overall appropriation. I expect them to respect the line item appropriation and of course the overall appropriation. So if there is the occasion, because life happens and a budget is your best estimate of the future, I'm involved in those decisions as if one line is going over, we typically have a very good explanation as to why. My position is, well, better make darn sure that you have resources elsewhere within the overall appropriation to cover that cost. A good example is salt and sand. We do our best to estimate what those costs are, and then Mother Nature happens. And so, always in the spring, typically in the spring, we'll have a sense of we're going to need a lot more salt or sand. And then Mike has to make accommodations elsewhere in his budget to make sure that he can withstand that overage. And I strongly advocate that we show the overage in the account that it occurs, really for historical purposes, so we can learn from it. As we're preparing the budget for the following year, you really need to have accurate estimates and make sure that those are shown in the line item detail.
great. Yeah, it would be, it seems like that's the way most municipalities manage it. It would be pretty restrictive to manage all the way down to the bucket level. I mean, you do manage it, you track it, but if you were going to go over on one and you had to get council, approval for more salt and sand, that would be, that wouldn't make sense. But what I hear you saying is that, the department heads keep an eye on it. And if they see they're going over in a bucket, you're totally in that mix to
Yeah.
evaluate and help them figure that situation out.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
guess,
we do a pretty good job, I'll say, across the 500 line items or so, based on, frankly, experience in history,
Right.
of staying pretty close to budget. The payroll lines are the ones that are harder to predict. If you have changes in personnel and
Number.
circumstance,
Right.
that can really create some variances.
right. So John, then the only other comment I would have about the charge would be, it's pretty budget focused, and I'm wondering at some point if there might want to be like a catch-all, because I know sometimes, and maybe the catch-all is, that the chair or the council as a whole requests us to do something. So, I mean, like today, the review of the lodge purchase, I mean, it's certainly an appropriation request, but it's not, and I guess maybe we could say it fits in an agency. I don't know. It doesn't seem to fit in an office, agency, or department of the town. It's a bond fund that the voters approved. It seems the right place that we should be talking about it, but I'm not sure it's covered here, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's one of the more complex items, I'd say, that we'll have to go over. Councilor Anderson, did you have your hand up?
I did, but I think it was addressed in the subsequent conversation. But just building off of what you guys are talking about now with the lodge, like I would agree with Councilor Gleistein that maybe there's something missing, that when there are these out of cycle investment decisions, it does feel like it's appropriate. I guess my question would be, how frequent are these? Do these happen often? Or is this Masonic Lodge thing kind of something that happens every couple years, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence, kind of out of cycle. Past councils have been really adamant, I might say somewhat to a fault, about pushing things through budget. And I understand the purpose of that, but sometimes it's not practical. The value of doing that, of course, is that you're able to value and have a conversation in the context of all the other needs at the same time, as opposed to kind of this in a vacuum. So it makes sense if time and circumstance allows. For what it's worth, past councils working under committees working under the same charge have focused a lot of their efforts on long-range financial planning, coming up with benchmarks and dashboarding to kind of report out the financial fiscal health of the town. That's not clearly worded as such, but I can tell you past councils have been all too comfortable with the committee taking up that sort of work as well.
Again, I think that policies and procedures relating to the financial affairs of the town are related to those dashboards and things like that. I kind of felt that one was covered.
Okay.
But these items out of cycle, I think the child care was another one. It's just such an unusual request. So I don't know if there's like a catch-all sentence that could be added. I mean, I don't think we need it, quite frankly, but if we wanted to say, and other, off-cycle financial requests from reserve account or bond fund, or fund, or, and then there's also, if we were to get a grant or money or some significant amount of money or something, so there may be a little bit of something that's not there, or it could just say by request of the chair or the council as a whole, because I think the chair definitely said, please look at review the lodge.
Yep. Or, when circumstances dictate. I mean, there could be some very, very broad language that
Right. Very broad. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I just Betsy, based off of what you were saying, it feels like that first sentence is broadly written enough that it kind of does capture that as I read it, because in my mind, if there is something that comes in at a cycle, I would consider that an appropriation request,
right? Yeah.
Which we review. Whether it's a grant or some other source of funding, I think it fits within that first sentence.
Yeah, I think it's more or less covered.
Yeah, I agree. And with the hall purchase, it's unique in that the appropriation was made by the voters, right? So
Right.
we appropriated 2.5 million, but only the town council can designate the use of that. So it's pretty much an appropriation request before us now, even though it's not going to have, the way it's worded, wouldn't have a budget impact on this year. It would tap funds that have already been appropriated.
My only question would be for the funds that are needed to get the property up to, you know, certain code, or I think to meet certain requirements that were in the findings. I'm assuming those come out of existing budget. And so that would have to be, if we decided to make those improvements, some sort of action where we would say those funds have to come from somewhere if we decided to do that, and we would have to align as a council and approve those, I'm guessing.
I agree, or they'd have to be in the budget for next
Yeah.
year.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Ruth.
They are in the order number that was, went to the voters, because it does say preserve significant historic sites and to preserve sites which can be considered part of the character to the community. So I think that gives you the leeway to make improvements to the property if needed.
Yeah, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it's my interpretation and my recommendation that the improvement cost is not an appropriate use of land bond funds. I think, and I would choose to bring those forward in the context of the next budget request through the capital plan. So it would get council approval, again, in the context of all the other needs that you have.
So I think we've covered half of 2 agenda items now.
Well, I'm not sure. I think there's 2 different viewpoints there if we're going to talk about that. So,
Okay.
um,
Do you mind deferring it until, or go ahead, Betsy, you can.
yeah, no, I think we should defer it till the agenda item.
Okay.
Could I offer one last observation? You know, I have not heard, and I guess I ask you if you have heard from your other colleagues on council, the 4 remaining members, if you're, I guess the test is, if you were getting pushback like this, stay in your lane, you shouldn't be doing this or that, then I think there would be cause for concern, and you might need to clarify the charge. I've never heard the rest of council saying, hey, we don't want you doing that or spending time on those things. More often than not, things are directed toward you. And for what it's worth, anything that has a financial component, if time and circumstance allow, I always like to go through committee and have them vetted here. So by the time it gets to council, you can be the ambassadors of that, or you can refine it, help me refine it to the point that it's ready for prime time and full council consideration. So, you know, you'll find me using you somewhat selfishly in that regard.
Yeah,
And we always have this to fall back on if we if we think we're getting too far out of our lane ourselves as well. But there's a lot here. This is it's going to be a busy committee this year. So
the charge works, and I think it was good to review it. So
awesome.
I'm good on both fronts.
John, you okay?
Yeah, I do find what Tom said earlier interesting about thinking more strategically about long-term financial planning. But I think, Betsy, you said you kind of see that in the bottom part. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's where I saw that, a policy or procedure related to the financial. Because a lot of policies and procedures have come out of the committee. So I really do.
Okay.
I feel like policy and procedure can be short-term, long-term, you know.
Okay. Yeah, and I think generally it makes sense to me.
And of course, moving on to the item 4-C's discussion of our goals and aspirations. And like Tom was saying, there's a number of ways that things can get put on our plate because we're an active working committee. Last year, we went through a goal setting process with the council, and a lot of them were actually centered around finances, but specifically the finance committee was charged with developing a 5-year plan, or actually developing the nature of the 5-year plan that staff would work on. That there was some progress made, but it was not something that was completed. I think I'd say in large part due to priorities and COVID that had happened. We are going to be having another council level goal setting meeting in January. And I thought it would be worthwhile to hear each other's thoughts on what might be our priorities for the year. so that as much as we might have something pushed to us, it may be something that we want to bring to the full council that we can work on or focus our efforts on next year. So I'll open the floor. Betsy, go ahead.
I'd like to speak to that last goal because I'm not sure exactly what happened. I was reviewing that and we had fairly significant discussion on September 18th meeting about it. And at that meeting, Ruth and Tom brought forward a 3-year plan where we were going to adapt the tax calculation sheet. And I think that we said that we all liked that format, the way it came out. I was having a little trouble listening to the stream again. I did go back and read the notes from that meeting. And we referenced that we would take it up in late October, and then we never did. So the last meeting that we had, so actually, I'm sorry, the meeting that we talked about it was August, the August 16th meeting. We did not talk about it in September. We just finalized the CEA policy in September. And then I think what happened was, so to get the CEA policy passed, we used finance committee time with the whole council for a workshop to get the CEA policy passed because it had been on the plate for over a year. But I feel like a lot of the work, I feel like we were getting close. And if we reevaluated as one goal where we left off on August 16th, I think we had something that was looking like it was going to be workable that Ruth and Tom had worked on. And that way we wouldn't lose that work.
Yeah, so I mean, that's certainly on the list for me. I think we have a new committee now, although 2 of us are the same. So I just thought it was appropriate to let's start fresh and decide where we want to head. I am not opposed to finishing that work. I think that's it's worthwhile. I think it's something that we can bring with us to the January meeting. That there's been some progress made. I think a lot of our time is going to be spent on budget work this year, and that's just the way it's kind of going to go. I think it's going to be a challenging year. Outside of that, there's probably a couple of things that we can move forward. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3. And I'd say this is for me that would be one of the things that I would consider. John, do you have anything?
I was just going to add, just to better understand, can you guys talk a little bit about what the intent was of the 5-year plan and kind of where things are, where they left off, and what's left to be done?
Yeah, that was actually the goal from the council, and it was to be able to look forward, especially, I mean, we do capital planning looking forward, but there was the thought that we don't look forward in all the buckets of what's coming up. So I don't know, Tom, do you want to try to jump in there and describe that better? Or John, we were both there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the best. Probably been drug along here, kicking and screaming a bit. I say that tongue in cheek, really. I think the value of that exercise is obvious, though I still have reservations around kind of the accuracy of looking that far out. We have trouble sometimes just budgeting the following year, much less 3 years out. But and particularly producing projected tax rates. I think there's just a cautionary note I have around how definitive that exercise is and the information that comes from it. So that's not to say I'm opposed to it. I'm just cautious about it. And I think you're right. I think we made great strides. It's just a matter of really advancing this forward. And I think this committee this year, we can actually make that part of the annual routine. And I'd like to do that. So we do this regardless of who's on committee, we just become accustomed to doing this year over year.
Yeah, I can try to talk a little bit about it, Betsy. So when you're doing the forecast, there's some things that, staffing costs and things that are subject to inflation that you're just going to pretty much roll forward, or you'll tie to some basis, right? And that could be, the basis could be your population, it could be your growth in residential units or whatnot, but they're very formulaic, right? Because assuming that your demand for police services moves with some measure, like population maybe, or then it's relatively easy to forecast those out. Unless you're making changes to the structure of how you're doing things, But I think for me, one of the major drivers or things that I think is important to focus on is your major capital improvements. So when you're going to be spending big ticket items, and we can put some definition around what big ticket means, but I think creating some clarity into the future about when we anticipate tackling some of those major capital projects, I think could be beneficial to the public and to the different groups that are thinking about taking on projects. I know the comp plan mentions a strategy. It may be along those lines, but I guess that's I think in addition to what you're saying, Betsy, with the financial forecast roll forward, one of the things I'd like to see us improve on is how we discuss and prioritize, evaluate major capital improvement projects.
Right. And we do have that. We do have the list. And then we basically, for the budget, we pull something over from the list and say, okay, we're going to do this next year. So there is a method to it. It's not like we don't know, like these things are coming up, but putting more around it. I agree with what you're saying, John, but I think that one of the particular things we were trying to accomplish was around the operational budget too. Just to better look a little bit forward on it.
Yeah. And I think, and the two feed into each other, right? So
Yeah,
go ahead, John.
I'm just wondering, John, just kind of going off of what you said about how this year is going to be a difficult year. And, from what I'm hearing, as I've talked to staff a little bit and some of the other committees I've been in, there were a lot of tough decisions that were made last year. And so really maybe this year, the goal is just to figure out how do we get things back to normal and maybe start reinvigorating the concept of this 5-year plan after budget, just to make sure, we don't lose sight of the focus of, last year, a lot of decisions were made around staff, equipment, things like that, hopefully once COVID lifts and things start to go back to normal, we're going to need to kind of revisit some of those decisions that were made and make sure we have the people, materials, tools, and things like that to support whatever the new normal looks like. So I'm wondering if we want to just really try and focus on that near term because it's tying into the budget, but then also kind of have the secondary goal for, H2 that really focuses more on that long-term planning element.
Well, I guess I would
both in parallel, but it feels like a lot.
Well, it probably is. And there's other things to add, but I guess I would request, maybe we have a meeting at a cycle. We only meet once a month, but sometimes, we meet more, especially in budget season, but sometimes for something special, just to at least pick up where we were so that work is not lost and then evaluate it from there, John. Do we want to take this forward and fine tune it and spend any time on it now? Or, because I'm not, I went back to watch to see where we were at on it. And I need to better understand where we're at. So I don't know, I guess I would, request it maybe as an agenda item for, 30 minutes or something that we at least pick it back up and see where it got left off and not make a commitment that we're going to do what you said, John, but that would be my request.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that would be good. And again, once I have a better understanding of what the scope was and what we were trying to do, there might be some elements in it that we can chip away at or prioritize that are maybe more important so that we keep it going. Again, I had some bullet points just written down of things I'd like to see as goals. Again, some of these might not be for this year, might be longer term, but especially around debt and looking at our debt, how do we make sure we have a 5-year plan that starts to chip away at that better? And again, we could probably think of this 5-year plan in many different elements that are going to help us kind of get to where we want to be. So I'd really like to kind of do what you said, Betsy, and have a 30-minute item in the future that we can really just kind of understand where we are, what it is, and is there a way to better structure it so that we can do it this year or at least make progress.
Yeah, just for some historical context, and anyone could speak to Peter Hayes. Peter was the consistent force on finance, I think, for all 6 years. He was on council, chair probably at least half of them. And to his credit, he was the one that kind of continued to this drumbeat. His interest really started with kind of the capital needs, big ticket capital needs. And of course, just appreciate when something's approved in the capital plan, the following year it becomes an operating expense by way of debt service. And so timing of those capital needs has potentially, when you're talking to $80 million school or something, can have tremendous effects on operating budget. So that's kind of where I'm trying to recall exactly his motivation, but I think his concern had a lot to do with these looming big capital needs and how are we going to, I would say, do them all. How are we going to do them without blowing the budget and forcing our taxpayers out of town?
Yeah, so I think that goes with what you were saying with debt, John. That's a good summary, Tom, because once we put something in the capital plan, it immediately goes into the debt, and then of course that hits the bottom line budget. So
right,
it is all tied together. But yeah, I think that
actually what I heard John Anderson saying is, what strategies can we bring forward to actually start chipping away at held debt? And that's a important but different discussion. I'm talking about adding.
That's a good point. So to switch from a debt model to a reserve model,
right.
where we put money in reserves to pay for things like the turf field.
I think those are. I think we're actually all talking about something very similar, right? In that, we want to look ahead a little bit to understand where we might be able to either afford things or how we can reduce our debt burden, or you can look at it different ways. But I think, Betsy, to your point, it very well may be a continuation of what the intent of last year's goal was. We never really got to the point where we had, I think, an in-depth discussion. I think a draft was put in front of us at one meeting, and we're like, hey, that looks pretty good, but I would be fine with. So here's the thing with having a half-hour meeting before the January 9th meeting. We'd have to have a meeting in the next couple of weeks to go over just what's been done on the 5-year plan. And I think we're probably aligned enough to go into that January meeting to suggest that we continue the work that was started this year.
Yeah.
And then when we have our January meeting, that can be a primary focus, I think, of that meeting. I'm seeing head nods.
I just remind you, Larissa's parting gift to me was to convince the past finance committee that we focus on a 3-year financial plan, not 5 years.
Great. Yes. Yep.
I'll be forever in debt to her for that.
John, so just to bring the other, or perhaps Councillor Anderson up to speed and refresh everyone else's memory, that meeting that Councillor Gleistein referenced in August, where we last spoke about the financial plan, whether it's 3 years or 5 years, Tom did put together a memorandum giving some background on that. This was a subject that was initially discussed back in 2018. And in that memorandum, not only does he give kind of a brief synopsis of why it perhaps got backburnered until August of this year, but also gives some links and instructions on how to recap or watch the last discussions on the subject. So I might suggest a homework assignment for the committee that we go back and look at those materials, watch those videos, and bring everyone up to speed. And then I think, for the next finance committee meeting, the committee perhaps could have a follow-up conversation, and everyone at that point will be on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
That's a recommendation.
Yeah, and that would be an example of, something that would be great to have in our finance committee folder somehow.
Okay.
I know we haven't really found a good way to organize all that stuff, but we do have the folder, and then you can go back and look at the minutes and the agendas, and the agendas usually contain the handouts, so you get quite a bit of information just going back through that. So that may be in there under agenda.
If you'd like, I could resend to all of you that agenda for that meeting with all the support documents, if it would be easier for you.
If it's all in the agenda, I pulled up the agenda today from the folder, so that was quite helpful for what I did find. I didn't know if what Liam was referencing was in there or not, because I didn't.
Page 37, Councillor Gleistein.
Okay, yeah, so it's in the agenda. So that's kind of the keeper of our documents. So that's good. That works.
Yeah, and what we'll do, there's a Google Drive that council has access to. If there isn't already, we'll create a folder for finance committee. So I'm not sure if this is a good candidate, but other materials, we can use that as a repository, kind of a quick reference as well. You have equal access to it. You can drop things there as well if you want to. If you have something that you think the full crowd would like to see and we'd like to recall in the future.
Right. Any other discussion on our goals or what we'd like to get out of this year?
So,
I have a, go ahead, Betsy.
oh, I'm sorry, John. So I
No, go
had
ahead.
affordable housing TIF and CEA policy. I know that's a big nut to crack, but I think our economic, we're using the economic development one right now, and hopefully we could develop, utilize most of it. So maybe it wouldn't be as heavy a lift as the first one we did, but I think there are some separate issues that go along with affordable housing TIFs and CEAs.
Okay.
And then the other one I have is really not fleshed out, so I don't think it's worth saying. So I'll leave it at that.
So some of my recommendations are maybe a little bit softer. Again, just to kind of document for us. So one would be, I think we should try and set some sort of goal around the budget, just in terms of, and again, it can be something soft. I don't know the words yet, but like we've done a really good job, or the council's done a really good job, in my opinion, the past couple of years, getting pretty good support and margins at the polls from the community. And I think just not losing the sight that we want to continue to do that and continue to get broad support when we propose the budget, including maybe even just kind of highlighting some of the great communications work that's been happening over the past couple of years to spur that support. And then I think just two other things. One would be, it appeared last year to the public, and again, this is just public perception from my perspective, that there seemed to be some tension between the school board and the town council. And I see in our charge, it talks about making sure that we're partnering with the town Department of Education. And so just trying to make sure we think through and partner with the finance committee over there to make sure we address that and rebuild that relationship. And then I think there's, I think John, you had mentioned this earlier, and I'm not sure, but I also kind of wrote it down coming into this, that, how do we establish some objectivity into how we make investment priority decisions? It sounds like we have the capital improvement plan, which is a good document that lists all of them, but I'm assuming we might want to be revisiting those continuously, knowing that things change, like introducing the school, kind of shifts a lot of things in there potentially, or could shift a lot of things in there. And so how do we want to make sure we're objectively evaluating some of these investments as they come up, these big, large ones, to make sure that we really are prioritizing them appropriately? So those are some of the things that I just wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, this isn't necessarily a goal, but it goes along the lines of, I think, your soft goal of perceiving, or I guess improving the, not necessarily relationship, but the perception of the roles and responsibilities between the town council and the Board of Education. I have had an initial discussion with Sarah Layden, who's chair of the BOE Finance Committee, and she started to solicit feedback on the idea of maybe us staying in our lanes a little bit more, where the town council is focused on the top level number, and the BOE is focused on working the numbers. And I think where we may have got to some of the friction last year is we set a goal of 3%, and we weren't in a steady state environment last year, right? Things were somewhat dynamic. So when we got to a few days before first reading, or the initial presentation, the numbers were somewhat dramatically off from, I think, where a number of counselors were expecting them to be. So there were some pre-first reading adjustments made. And I think what I heard from Sarah was that we'd like to avoid the pre-first reading adjustments if we can this year. or at least to have establish some traceability from this is what was passed to us from staff, and this is the adjustments that the council or BOE made, and this is what was approved at the end. So I guess I kind of like the way you phrased the soft goal, John. It's just improve the perception of the different roles and responsibilities for budget work between the BOE and the town council.
But I think, didn't the council pass a policy about this? Did it become a policy? There was something about a first read target.
We adopted a goal of no more than 3%, but no, we never passed that. I know what you're referring to. There was some work done to come up with targets, but that was again, that was assuming a steady state environment.
Yeah, I think I could offer just some historical perspective. There's always been a budget goal. What we haven't done a good enough job is to articulate when the goal needs to be reached. So for instance, I'll just use the simple goal of tax rate increase of no more than 3%, as you know, for the longest time was the goal. The BOE was aware of that. It's pretty easy to understand. But at first reading, they would never be there. They would be at, some outlandish number with the full expectation that it's really where we end is what's important, what the final budget is. So there's been some friction about not what the goal is, but when it needs to be met. And I think some of the work that Councilor Hamel pushed forward last year in particular was around being very clear. And I think, as I recall, the goal actually had two components, first reading and second reading, to try to address that sort of disconnect and avoid. And as you say, John, then COVID took over and we went sideways for the spring. So, but that's still a very important point, is to be very clear what the goal is and when the expectation to meet it is.
Right. Yeah, because I think they had set through a joint finance committee in 2018, they set a goal of 6% for first read. And, so we'd have to go back and look at the history of it, but
yep.
It was about the timing of, how everything got presented, I think, at the first read. And it was done so that, that was an attempt to reduce friction, right?
Yeah.
To some extent.
You're right. I think first read goal was 6% for them, 4% for us, but we end up less than 3%. And then last year, because of situations, the goalposts changed, almost weekly, it seemed. And that was just a source of frustration all the way around, I think.
Right. Well, let's hope that was an anomaly.
Oh, let's hope so.
Yeah.
Something else we may be able to take up in January is we're more than likely going to come up with a financial target at our council meeting, our workshop, and it'll probably be less than 3% target again this year. I guess I'm not anticipating bringing something different, but it might make sense for us to kind of discuss that, given what we know through the end of second quarter this year at our next finance committee meeting, to try to come up with some high level expectations of this is what, to hit that target, this is about what we would expect from the schools versus the town. I don't know if there's an appetite for us to have that discussion before the budget presentation.
Yeah, I'm not sure we'll have Q2 quarterlies done in time to inform that discussion.
When do you anticipate those will be done?
Well, I mean, the quarter closes at the end of December, end of the month. So, Ruth, I guess it's entirely on you.
Do we know when the next meeting is? I'm sorry, I don't think I have that date.
So, and I skipped that part of the agenda, but our regular meeting is the fourth Tuesday of the month, right?
Actually, the fourth Wednesday of every month.
So it'd be the end of January.
Be the 27th, I believe.
As long as we know, it takes us a little over a week to prepare those. So as long as we have the time to do that, then, and we know that that's going to be on the agenda, then we can have those ready.
I misunderstood. I thought you were trying to have that done before the council met on the 9th.
No, so after the council meets on the 9th, I thought it might make sense for us to, as a finance committee, to try to further refine that 3% target, so that we can come a little bit closer at first read and hopefully be a little more prepared.
Good, that makes sense. I think we can accommodate.
Okay.
I have a question. So when it comes to when we set the goal, do we have the revenue projections to help us understand what we're projecting from like the state and other sources of revenue for the next year to help us? Because I feel like that to me would be really helpful to have to help us figure out what's the right target. And knowing, again, I think I've heard this and I don't know if this is true, but that we could probably anticipate less state support this year, or next year, I guess, because of what's been happening with COVID and everything. And so I think it's important that we understand what are we anticipating revenue projections to look like, to then figure out what's the right goal we want to set.
But these are the moving pieces as we move through the process, right? So I think they'll start with the revenue projections in March, maybe February for revenue sharing. On the school side, I think it comes out starting the end of January. But all these, they're all subject to move. So a lot of times the council goal happens before we have that information, which I think is why we focus it on. This is what we're gonna manage it to the impact on the taxpayer. Is kind of the way we've approached it.
Well, and of course, for me, personally, I mean, this is a long-standing tradition, the way that it's done in Scarborough. If I could wave a wand, I would focus a lot more on the budget and the budget increases and understand the budgets instead of the mill rate, which becomes critically important, but we don't have all those pieces of the pie. But it's very difficult to do that in Scarborough. So even last year, when it seemed like it would make the most sense to really focus on the budget and not the mill rate.
You're so right, Councillor Gleistein. I think there's an understandable but unhealthy fixation on mill rate. It ends up being the tail that wags the dog. It's at the expense of substantive discussion of priorities and values.
Yeah.
I agree fully, Betsy. So maybe we'll be able to make a dent in that this year. I'm not saying we'll be able to change it, but hopefully we can certainly focus more on the expenditure side of the bucket.
I'm not saying it's not important, but one thing that is helpful is to look at year over year budget changes, and the budget goes up much more because we are receiving more revenue, so that makes sense. And we have more services, but it's definitely would be helpful, I think, to look at those numbers all on their own and then start wrapping the revenue in. And we kind of had to do that more last year, but even last year we didn't do it. We kept focusing on the mill rate.
Yeah, normally this is the second year of the state biennial budget. So typically in the second year of the biennium, we have a lot more certainty around a lot of these factors. This year, not so much because of how the state budget's been decimated. So, what was passed in the state budget, I think is going to change. How and how much is the $1 million question. The good news is we're such a low receiver. The changes the state makes will hurt and affect us, but in large part, that's the silver lining of minimal receivership. They can't take much more away from us, frankly, anymore on the school side.
Yeah, but it's a lot, it was 4 million and something to the schools. I mean, it turned out to be 20 something million on including our excise and all that. So non-property tax revenues, I feel like, is a pretty significant piece of the pie. So if I was to say somewhere, John, that the frustration, John, that for the school board was when we just focused on mill rate, like they have very little control over that. They don't take in the revenue. They do get, they get the minimal receivership. That's the one that the schools get. But then beyond that, all the other revenue funnels through the town, the permits, the excise tax, and, they have a few other little sources of revenue, but not much really. And so then when we focus them on saying, you got to come in at 6%, it's just, it's a challenge in terms of that.
But the 6% is on expenses. It does focus on spending, not on mill rate. That first reading.
Well, I didn't remember it that way, but you certainly could be right. Yeah. I felt like that 6% was also focused on mill rate.
No, I believe it was focused on expenditures, the things that we
Okay.
control.
Gross budget, yeah, which is,
Yeah, well, that makes more sense then.
so what I think this has been a good discussion. I think we've gotten further enough where I might be able to summarize what we've talked about and where we seem to have consensus. And worst case, we can all walk in with having the benefit of having had this discussion already when we get to the council goal setting meeting. I wanted to step back in the agenda. I failed to establish a regular monthly meeting time and date. And as Colette had said, our regular time is the fourth Wednesday of the month at 4 o'clock. Correct me if I'm wrong, Colette.
No, you're right.
Does anybody have any concerns or issues with that regular meeting time? Understanding we'll probably be meeting weekly once we get into the budget work.
Sorry, John, did you say fourth Wednesday?
Fourth Wednesday of the month at 4 o'clock. Okay. Colette, can we do an action item and take a roll call vote just to formalize our regular meeting time?
Certainly. Councillor Clucci,
Yes.
Councillor Anderson,
Yes.
Councillor Gleistein.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, the next topic is a big one. It relates to the potential purchase of the Governor William King Lodge. This is item 4-D. Tom, did you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, just a couple of comments at the top. We are officially, we're not in the market for property. I will characterize this as an opportunity that has presented itself. And so, though I do believe it's a wise purchase for a number of reasons we can get into, it was not on my radar screen. And so for that reason, opportunities present themselves. It is out of cycle, but real estate deals are time sensitive. And so if we have an interest, I've been successful in at least securing the option for the council to consider this and decide. The matter is scheduled for action tomorrow evening for the council. If the council wishes to move forward, there would be there's a due diligence period that extends 14 days beyond that. We have had the occasion to do some pretty thorough investigation of the property and have a pretty good sense of what we're getting into. I thought that was important for the council. If I were you, I'd want to know, be fully informed, not just purchase price, but what is the condition, what are the potential uses, what are the potential costs we're looking at in the future. So we certainly can and need to refine those numbers a bit further, but I think we've got some discussion points. I guess the other point, and this is the one that this committee probably ought to focus on, is, and I think the council might be interested in your opinion on the matter, I am proposing the use of voter-approved land bond funds, and probably the titling them land bond doesn't give it fair characterization, but traditionally they have been used for purchase of land for conservation purposes. But you'll see the two highlighted bullets here, and this incidentally was actually the language verbatim of the referendum to the voters. And so there are, in my view, at least two express categories that this purchase fits into. I don't need to read them for you. So in my evaluation, I think it's a very consistent and appropriate and lawful use of these funds for this purpose. In fact, there's some precedent on point. The council did use some of the remaining prior land bond funds to assist in the rehabilitation of the schoolhouse up on Holmes Road. That work is now complete, I believe. So there's some historical precedents of doing what I'm suggesting. Again, the benefit of these funds is that they are voter approved. These aren't monies in hand. Practically speaking, if you approve the purchase, we would actually make the purchase happen with cash on hand, our fund balance, if you will, and then reimburse ourselves in the spring when we go out to bond a bond, which we do on an annual basis. So that's maybe too quick a tee up on the issue, and I'm sure you have lots of questions.
Well, I guess my first question was the one we started talking about earlier about the amount of work that the property needs.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like, if we used these funds to rehab the school, we'd be using these funds to rehab this building. So I'm not quite seeing the difference there, but you mentioned the upcoming budget cycle, but it also looked like, according to the engineers, there's work that has to be done right away because the building is in decline. So,
yeah, I will say there's no visible water damage on the inside. If I had my druthers, we'd do the work as soon as we could. But I think waiting until late spring, early summer through the budget is not going to be the end of the world. I guess I could probably argue successfully that some of these improvements would possibly fit, particularly those on the exterior that are really serving to extend the historic preservation component. But that starts to get a little slippery for me. It's just my opinion. I don't think any of the interior renovations, I think that's even a further stretch. ADA accommodations to suit our purposes for the intended uses. In my evaluation, I think that's a real stretch of using these funds for that purpose.
Okay. I wonder if we can get an update on the schoolhouse. I don't mean to insult anyone here, but just to kind of understand better how these funds have been used. I don't want to, it doesn't look like it's finished, but perhaps it is. So I think it would be good to understand that project, what we set aside from the land bond and what got done. And, do the people who asked for the money, do they feel that the work is finished? Was there a project plan? So I think there would need to be something similar for this so we could understand what's getting done when. And, presumably, I guess some of it gets put off if the budget's tight.
Yeah, the amount of funds that I've asked for authorization before the council tomorrow night simply accomplishes the purchase. It does not account for any renovation expense. And so implicit in that amount, obviously, is my interpretation that use of land bond funds is really not appropriate for anything other than the purchase in this context. You can disagree with that if you like. And my intention was to bring forward not all of these, but perhaps some of these as soon as the next budget cycle through the capital program.
Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with your take on it.
There's one intermediate play that I don't want to get into in great detail, but I can certainly talk about it. In any conventional real estate transaction, and this is on its face, although I must admit that I think we're kind of viewed as a bit of a preferred buyer because of who we are and the position, the stewardship that we'll bring to the property. I think the seller does favor us in that regard. But in a normal real estate transaction, you do the due diligence like we've done here. We understand the condition and potential investments, and there's an opportunity for seeking concessions. And I'd like to engage in that conversation candidly with council in an executive session to seek certain concessions and actually lower the purchase price.
So when I look at this from a finance committee perspective, I was challenging it to try to say, all right, is it an appropriate use of funds? And the way that I read the referendum that was put in front of the voters and the opportunity before us, I view it as an appropriate allocation of those land bond funds. Then the other thing that tripped me up was, well, we had the discussion about appropriations, right? And I guess a lot of times we only appropriate through the budget process, and it's an annual season or an annual event. But then there are some capital items that are appropriated outside of the budget cycle. And when I read what was in front of the voters, item 2 says that a sum not to exceed 2.5 million is hereby appropriated. So we're not actually appropriating these funds. They've already been approved by the voters. We just need to give the town manager our approval to spend them. So I guess in terms of checking all the boxes from what I understand are different policies, it seems to. One thing that tripped me up a little bit, when I read some of the material that was put out to promote the land bond referendum, and this was done by the land trust, so it wasn't done by the town. But one of the items was, who decides how will the money be spent? And they talk about the Parks and Land Conservation Board being kind of the gatekeeper there. I don't think there's any legal authority for that to be the case, but I don't know if anybody, if Tom, you can speak to that.
Yeah, the express purpose of the Parks and Land Conservation Board is to evaluate land conservation purchases. So I think there is a distinction there. I can't say with certainty that, this is the fourth referendum that the voters have approved. I can't speak with certainty that the first, second, I can with the third, have included the same language that extends to historic sites. It may have been that in the first instance, it was strictly land conservation, and these uses have been kind of expanded over time. And that committee hasn't caught up to it, so to speak. But if you look at their charge and the actual work that they do, it's all solely focused on land conservation. I don't know how they would actually have an opinion in this regard. Not that it's required, but, and you haven't formally heard from your Historic Preservation Implementation Committee, but they are a council-appointed advisory board, the closest to having, I think, an appropriate opinion on such a matter. I think all of their sitting members have individually communicated with you and expressed interest, though they've not met as a body and offered a recommendation as such, but to a person, they have individually. So I would suggest that that has some bearing and weight as well.
Good. John, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so, as I read what's here in front of me, every time I read it, I feel like I have a different view on this. But when I read the beginning of it and the what's in the referendum, I notice that we say and after each bullet, which could be interpreted as, in order for us to use this bond, all of these bullets need to be met, not a subset of those bullets. And so it's just making me wonder, like, when people read this or when people read the referendum, were they really thinking that? Because like when I think of it that way, I think of this as now us purchasing big swaths of land where maybe there might be something on there that has some historic value, not necessarily a building. And so it's just making me now question, is this really in scope of this or not?
I understand your point, but I can say, just having participated in councils having this discussion, approving this very language, these are all allowed uses, as opposed to they must all be met to qualify. And maybe it should be an or instead of an and.
But the voters voted with an and to me, when I read the and really does mean in addition to, not or. And so again, this makes me question, is this really within scope only with only two of those bullets being met?
I think you're talking about a unicorn. I can't imagine that there's a property in the town of Scarborough that would meet all of those conditions.
Good point. Maybe it could be clarified. There is a next time we go through it, but I didn't read it that way. And I still don't. I'm trying to get there. But I think it would be unreasonable to have a single property that ticked all of these boxes. I think that would be very, very unique or rare. Betsy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it probably should have been or, but it's not. And I think the intent is that it would meet some of them, one or some of them, so on this agenda item, what are you looking for, John? Or what are we looking for as a committee? Just that we go back with the recommendation that it's an appropriate use. And we make a recommendation on whether the repair is an appropriate use, or are we going to discuss whether the finance committee in general feels this is a good purchase for the town?
So I was asked to put it on our agenda. So I agreed to have a discussion. And to the extent there are some key topics or points that we agree on, and it doesn't have to be unanimous, but if a couple of us feel strongly, then I would like to share that with the council. That and some items that we could go ahead, John, if you have a suggestion.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's appropriate that we agree with what Tom said at the beginning. That even though I think, Ruth, you had said maybe the improvements could be considered within scope, we agree as a finance committee that those are out of scope for land bond fund use, and that anything we want to do with those improvements, do we recommend we need to, have an out of cycle budget discussion to address those improvements now, or do we defer those until the budget, like Tom suggested? And I think we just need to kind of give a recommendation in terms of, one, is this in scope, yes or no? And what are we going to do about the improvements, and when, and where are they going to be funded out of?
And is there a reserve fund that might pick up some of this, because the use that's being talked about is for community services, and this would become another venue for community services. And do they have money in a reserve fund that could fund some of those improvements?
So I think those are all, that's a great thing to track down, maybe after we preserve the historic property. So the way that it's going to be worded for the council is, do we approve using land bond funds for the purchase? And I think we could opine on that. And then we could also add our opinion, I think, to whether we feel that renovations would be an appropriate use. From my perspective, I think that this is an appropriate use of land bond funds for the purchase. And I would prefer not to go there for the renovations. I would prefer to see that handled through the regular budget cycle. And maybe some of them will go to the capital budget. Some might be just in the operational budget as well.
Reserve funds.
Or reserve funds, yeah.
Yeah, so this seems to me like that the main, one of the primary reasons that we're purchasing it is for the future use of the fire station. And so I thought we had a letter from a resident, Ms. Sue Hamill, that had some good suggestions if that's what we're looking to do. But I am just not convinced that this is, I think it fits the definition. But I at first was for it, but now I really feel that, this is not something that the town needs to purchase. We do need to see if we can have a way to preserve, to get some of that land, I think, for future use for the fire department. But I know that's a disappointment to people that want to preserve it, but I just don't see it as something the town should be doing.
I think this actually, Tom, I'm hoping you can help explain this to me as well. But Councilor Ken Johnson, expressed concern that he wanted to ensure that this property was going to be preserved, right? And he did that at our last council meeting and has reached out since. Does the fact that we're using land bond funds for the purchase have any impact on what we might be able to do with it in the future?
I think politically speaking, in public relations, absolutely. I think it would be a travesty and you'd be exposed for all sorts of criticism, perhaps even some sort of legal action. I'm not sure who would bring that if you raise the structure or somehow alter it such that its historical value is diminished. I personally, having done this for 30 years, have a lot of faith in the collective conscience of the community, whether it's me and any of you sitting in the council chairs, that this structure will be preserved. I think there is a way, if you wish to self-impose deed restrictions. I'd recommend you don't do that. You just can't predict the future. But I have a lot of confidence, I don't have guarantees, that a future council isn't going to tear down or alter structure such as that its historic integrity is compromised, I think that would be suicide.
So if our intent was to flip it, I think, which is along the lines of what I think Ms. Hamill was suggesting, the source of funds should not be land bond funds. I think I can say that kind of, or
correct. Was that her suggestion, that we're flipping it?
yeah, that we purchase it with the intent to clean up some of the easements for parking and then turn around and sell it. Is the way I interpret it.
That's not certainly my suggestion or intent, and if that is someone else's intent, I would agree. Land bond funds should not be used for that purpose.
Okay. So can we circle back now? Do we all agree that it sounded, Betsy, like you were saying that you agree that it is an authorized or appropriate use of land bond funds? You just don't disagree with using it for this one.
Yes, it seems, I don't understand where it fits in the comp plan, really. I'm concerned, I did say in the last meeting, about the number of venues that we may end up having, because they all cost money to maintain. I'm not sure that it's very friendly for the types of things that we're talking about using it for, because it's such limited parking, and I do believe we will need a good deal of the property for the fire department. So, if there was maybe a way to make it a small museum or something, I don't know. It's kind of like, well, we should just buy it and then see what happens. And I guess that's tough for me to go there, because we're talking about a significant amount of operating expense to even fix it up so that we can use it. And then on top of that, you're going to have more staff, and it kills me to say it, because I definitely want a space for the seniors. I just don't feel that this one is it. So that's just me.
I'll be the first to admit that the community uses is kind of an uncomfortable force fit. We were just trying to be thought-provoking and suggest different options. The interior space does not lend itself well to active or even passive community services program. I'll be the first to admit that. So before we make any renovation, but let me back up. I think it's fair to consider the improvements in two buckets. One would be to kind of secure the integrity, the structural integrity, roof, trim, foundation. And then the rest of it would be kind of interior renovation that is more directed by how you wish to use the building. And we haven't made that decision yet.
Which I think, to Ruth's point about, the roof, the foundation, whatever, that, and if you compare that to the little schoolhouse, that could possibly come from land bonds, because that is, you would have to do those things to preserve it. I think that falls under the definition of preserve. And then I think, like you say, the second bucket of, now we have preserved it, what are we going to do with it? That really would have to come from a different bucket. I do agree with that. And that's kind of where I get into it. Now we own it, we've preserved it. What are we going to do with it? We know that part of the property could be useful to the town because of the fire department. So it's just a tough one. I wish somebody else would buy it and preserve it, but I'm having a tough time seeing it for the town doing it, the taxpayers.
Well, there might be someone out there with an altruistic spirit, but I fear, and why I swooped in to at least preserve this for this conversation to happen, is that I fear at the left of the open market, someone is going to buy it and they're going to put it to some productive use. I don't know what that is. I don't know who they are, but we may well be disappointed with the historic integrity. And again, when I say our first interest is to protect our existing investment, which is the firehouse, and to a lesser extent, the historical society to the rear, simply put, the wrong person buying this property could make our life very difficult, because we actually across this property. Liam, if you can pull up the property boundary, it's probably easier. Just appreciate those spaces right where his cursor are here, these two white vehicles. Those are spaces on town property and for the fire station. The only way to access those is across this property. So an unfriendly neighbor could make our life very difficult.
Okay, so that makes sense. So we are saying that is our primary interest in purchasing it.
Yes, I think I've stated that
Okay, yeah,
every time.
yeah. I'm not saying you didn't. I didn't hear it as clearly as that. So that's quite helpful.
The way that our historic preservation provisions read as well, there's not much incentive to preserve the historical integrity of this building for somebody new coming in, because the way it's worded is you can get bonus density or residential density on another part of the land that's not deemed historic, and this is really its own site. So unless somebody else owned the fire station, for example, I think if it went to on the open market, there's a decent chance that somebody would try to develop it into a commercial enterprise, something that they can make money off of. And I think.
So what do we get for property taxes a year on this property right now?
Give me a minute.
Sorry, I'm sure it's in the documentation. I apologize for asking an impromptu question I should already know the answer to.
It's valued at 309,000. So someone in this group can do the math for me.
About 4,500 is what I came up with.
What'd you say, John?
About 4,500 a year.
Okay.
So maybe John, just to get back to your key question about our charge and what we're trying to do for tomorrow, is all we're doing then is just recommending whether this fits within the land bond use at this point?
Yeah, if we can agree to that, yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I can get a show of hands or a nod that we can go forward to the full council that we've reviewed this. It does seem to fit within the intent of the use of funds. It does seem to comply with the charter. And we might have to stop at that.
Yeah.
We're going to each have our own individual opinions on the matter, and we can express them tomorrow. But I think I'm trying to make sure that we've at least crossed a couple T's and dotted a couple I's that yes, this makes sense.
Yeah, how you individually come down on that threshold question doesn't necessarily dictate how you'll feel about whether the purchase should happen or not. It's just a matter, is this an appropriate use of funds?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I mean, would it change what you're asking for, Tom, if we did a third caveat to say that anything that was used specifically for the preservation of the building, roof, foundation, whatever, could also come from those funds?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not going to oppose that. I frankly wanted to be very conservative in my view, but I think you're right. There's precedent, and I think an argument could be made that there's items, and what I would put in that category would be the roof, the foundation, and the trim. That's a total of $31,000 based on this estimate.
I would be comfortable going there, Betsy. Phrasing it that way, the purchase price plus renovations used for deferred maintenance would be an appropriate use of the funds. John, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I'd be okay with that.
Now,
Okay.
Do we want to form this as formalize this with a vote, or do you want me to just do a report out as chair?
We can vote
Report out as chair. We
toward that.
kind of had a consensus, I think.
Okay, all right, I'll do that.
Just, John, for your benefit, what's in the council's agenda for tomorrow is an authorization not to exceed 385,000. What that number is based on is a purchase price at 379, and I've padded it for some expected closing costs. I think it's probably only a couple thousand, but I added a little more, not to exceed number. So effectively, if that's the will of the recommendation of this committee and the will of the council, that number ought to be increased by 31,000.
Well, Tom, I thought you had said earlier when we were talking that you were thinking about, based on some of this, going back with a separate asking potentially, or that was going to be up for discussion. Did I misunderstand that?
My plan had been to come to you at budget time with all costs beyond the purchase price. But if it's the will of council to authorize use of land bond funds for some of those improvements related to historic preservation, now would be the time. I don't necessarily see the reason to come back in a second step.
Well, I was just thinking of what Councilor Katarina said at our last meeting, where she had said, based on the repairs and things that need to be done, rather than going in at full asking, were we going to go back and potentially renegotiate based on the findings of this report?
Well, I think Tom was going to ask for a
Oh.
not to exceed. And so if he can get it for less, he'll get it for less.
Yes, and in fact, there's an executive session before the meeting tomorrow to have that discussion.
Okay.
I've got some thoughts in that regard, and I'm hopeful that I can get concessions. Whether they're sufficient enough to cover the cost of these improvements, I can't say. So the safest thing to do, if that's the intention, is to give an authorization not to exceed. And obviously, I won't spend it unless I need to.
Yeah. Okay.
Betsy, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, for the preservation pieces, if this is something we do, I think that should come from the land bond fund, because you can't preserve it without doing that basic work. And then when we get into uses, I think that's got to come from somewhere else.
So
Because-
Tom, are you thinking we can change the agenda item, or are you thinking that the finance committee should amend it?
It would need to be amendment to the number. It
Okay.
would be to 416.
So I'd be happy to put that amendment forward, and then the council can opine on it.
That would be great. And if in the discussion around that amendment, you could offer the consensus opinion of the finance committee, I think that would be a nice flow to it.
Can you give me the total amount? It's 416, was it?
Yeah, it's 385 plus 31. I think it's 416.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, so next up on the agenda was a quarterly budget update.
Sure. We got Ruth here with us.
So as a final piece on the prior agenda item of the Governor William King Lodge, I did look it up. It's considered tax exempt property. So there are no taxes on it, even though there's property value on it.
Thank you.
Well,
I
there
should
you
know
go.
that.
Thank you.
So we have the September 30th reports. I don't know if I did get this finished, but I didn't see it on there. So I don't know if you actually received it or not, but I can send it out if you haven't.
Colette did send it to us.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
So things are going fairly well right now. In terms of state revenues, we're above average for where we should be after 3 months. And just as an update, in state revenue sharing, through 6 months anyway, we should be around, last year through 6 months, it was 604,000. This year through 6 months, we are over 700,000. We're at 740,000. So I think I think in terms of the state for right now, we're doing pretty good with the state revenues.
And what makes up that? Because there was, we know that we were going to get more homestead, and there were a few other state things that changed. So are we up of where we would expect to be with the legislation that was going to give us more revenue before the pandemic? Or
Well, that's just state revenue sharing. So after
just the state revenue sharing?
yeah, so right now we're after 5 months, we're about almost 100,000, more than 100,000 higher than we were at this same point last year. So in those terms, the state's kind of providing that. Whether it continues or not, I'm not 100% sure. You know, it's going to depend on
Right.
Christmas and the rest of the
Yeah,
sales tax.
I can tell you that for state revenue sharing, which is a combination of sales and income, for sales tax have really exceeded their expectations in two key areas. You know, everyone expected meals and lodging and hospitality would be down considerably, and in fact it is. I see John with a long look on his face. But what's actually happened is internet sales have been extremely brisk, and auto sales. Both of those have really buoyed state revenue sharing, state receipts, and therefore revenue sharing back to municipalities.
Right. And my understanding is, at least so far, they're giving out wherever they're getting it from what they had budgeted for us before the pandemic really hit. So there may be a shortfall, but they had what they sometimes refer to as a rainy day fund that they were making up. So I haven't dug into that number to see, you know, what, because you can find the reports sometimes. This is what they expected and this is what they actually paid out. It's been a little bit difficult to find. And they don't always, they're not timely with giving it. But what it appeared was that based on whatever they had budget, they were using reserve money to make that up wherever it fell short. So for the municipalities, it was good news because we were just getting what we were budgeted.
Well, and remember, we did lower our sites as well. That was one of the final adjustments that we made before budget, is to lower the expectation beyond what the state had advised.
Right, in a couple of areas, especially.
Yeah, and that being one of them. I think my recollection is we lowered it by $300,000 as a final move.
Right. I guess my only point was we were expecting more, apart from the pandemic, we were expecting more this year because we had been allotted more by the state.
Correct.
Correct. And the state did come back kind of after we did our budget and said, oh, you know, don't really count on that. But we had already brought it down. So. Right.
Yeah. So we're getting some more. We expected some more, but it sounds like maybe we're not getting as much as we had expected, which makes sense given the circumstance. And we lowered it anticipating that.
So importantly, to budget, I think we're on track, actually ahead of schedule, which is the real important piece.
And excise tax is ahead as well, huh?
And then with the homestead exemption, the state usually gives us, I don't know, around 80% of whatever they believe we're going to get back.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got a good chunk of that already. We're at roughly about 75% collected as of today, but and we'll get the rest of it towards, I think, May or June.
Okay.
So those funds are pretty much based on what we actually have for homestead exemptions, and the amount that they increase the amount that people get as an exemption, but they also increase the amount that they'll reimburse us, which is nice. And I think that was a good chunk of that increase as well. So we reduced the amount of interest rate that we charge to citizens who don't pay their taxes on time. The state has a goal of 8%. We dropped it down to 5%. We're seeing a little bit of that reduction compared to last year because people are now getting ready to pay, for who haven't already paid, their 2019 taxes. And so there's really very little interest that we're collecting on those folks. Whereas in prior years, if it was at 9%, which is what it was, we would get, probably almost a year's worth of interest. And that, that adds up and that helps to provide for the bottom line and helps for those folks who actually do pay their taxes on time. So we're finding that licenses and building permits, electrical and plumbing are not as high as they could be this year. So I'm not 100% sure what is driving that. I think in the beginning of the year, things were, folks were actually doing that, using, going out for permits and getting those permits, but not so much right now. I think some of it has to do with some of the larger businesses that had purchased, permits like the Scarborough Downs people, and they may not be doing as much right now, or they're in a lower phase.
Well, do recall these numbers are as of end of September. We've had a very brisk fall. So I have full expectations that when we have this conversation again at the end of Q2, you're going to see quite a catch up. I think we're doing quite well in that regard.
So that kind of covers where we are with the revenues. So things are, last year at the end of September, we were around 78.2% collected school in town. This year we're at 78.3. So we're pandemic aside, we're kind of where we should be.
Awesome.
In terms of the expenditures, it's kind of the same thing. It was hard to kind of go through and put some notes together because this year's budget is lower to some degree than last year's. Or they're about the same actually, but we're spending less. So last year at this time we had spent school in town about 21.6%. Now we're at 20%. So, we're not spending as much, but we did cut quite a bit out of the budget, knowing that this whole pandemic thing was here.
So the takeaway is we're spending less than you'd expect, and our revenues are tracking in a positive fashion. So that's my big takeaway.
I'm really glad you pulled this together because there's been a lot of question marks about how things would come in, and this, it's only one quarter, it's subject to change, but the wheels haven't fallen off the bus yet. So that's encouraging.
And then the last piece is that I had a question a couple of years ago on this, so I thought I would bring it up again, is that I call them quarterly reports, but really this is the only one that's a real quarter. After that, it becomes a year to date. So it'll be, the one you get at the end of December will be for a 6-month period. And then the one after that will be for the 9 and then the whole year. So I still call them quarterly because you're getting them on a quarterly basis.
And what's the item that we're shifting the fire department's, or we move certain facility costs to executive?
So there was some discussion. I know we've kind of talked about having a facilities budget, if you will, and I think this might be the beginning of that to some degree. We had a lot of difficulty this past year. I think there were supposed to be 1 or 2 full-timers for this building, and then there was like 1 over at the police station. Public Works was looking for someone during the budget, and we had a hard time filling those positions. So I'll let Tom talk.
Yeah, more importantly,
Right.
with
Can
with
you
the
bring
new
up the
building
line
company.
item that we're talking about? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Tom. I'm just trying to, I know what we're talking about, and I remember this whole discussion, but
It's page 4, Liam.
Page 4.
Yeah.
And
It's actually under the executive, and it was under a split between fire and police. Now it's all under the executive budget.
Yeah, and the issue there is prior to coming into the new building, the facility costs for the old public safety building were kind of equally borne in both police and fire. They kind of shared that responsibility. With the advent of this new building, in this FY21 budget, we moved all those facility expenses out of their budgets and into mine, just to clean it up and to isolate them. So there's a positive effect from a budget point of view on their budgets, a negative effect on my executive line.
then we added a position, right?
That was approved in the budget, correct?
Yeah, we approved a new position.
But I think the biggest change there is, I've got all the utility accounts, all the costs associated with maintenance of that facility are now under executive and out of their budgets.
that makes sense. Are we, I know we didn't exactly know what the operating costs were going to be for the new building. Are they coming in around what we expected, or any surprises there?
It's a little difficult to say right now because we've gone through essentially 3 months under because we don't have the staffing. We didn't pay the staffing. So even as of today, for that one area, we're only about 12% spent.
Okay.
We also need to, and we have the answer, but the electricity comes to a single meter. The systems in the new building have the ability to split that out. And so I'm not sure that we've properly allocated all the utility expense yet. So we'll be getting there. So I can't definitively answer that question, but mechanical systems are up and running, have been fully commissioned, and I think are operating at kind of expected efficiencies.
So we did move those budgets that were originally in fire and police out, and now they're in Tom's budget. I think this year is a start to see where things will end up, and we'll be able to probably better appropriate needs next year, because we'll have something to compare to.
Excellent. Betsy or John, did you have any other questions on the quarterly update?
No, thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think it's going to be really beneficial to review this quarterly, as you've done in the past. I think especially going into the budget, to some of John's questions about where revenues are, we'll at least have a better feel for where we're at this year, even if we don't have a firm
And if anyone has any questions, you know, I'm here most of the time, so feel free to give me a call and we can set up a time or whatever to go over questions.
And perhaps it gives you comfort, but you know, we obviously look at these much more often and carefully than you do, perhaps. If we see variances happening that are kind of, that we can't change, that are going to change how we're going to end the year, I'd like to try to recognize those early and take corrective action, whether it's imposing curtailments or other evasive action. And I certainly have done that as soon as start of the second quarter, when trends are very clear that they're irreversible for one reason or another. So far, so good. I don't see any need to take any action like that yet, but I'll keep monitoring it.
Great. Yeah. Next item on the agenda was an update on the hybrid childcare program. And I think this was at Councillor Gleisten's request. And the council chair also had asked for it. So Tom, are you going to cover this?
Yeah, Liam actually has been working very closely with Todd Souza and his staff, and I think is the one that's going to present this material.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And
thanks for nothing. Is that what you said?
No. I said that. No, it was a genuine appreciation. So again, bear with me as I try to give a high-level overview to how we tried to provide this update. So and again, I know that this predates Councillor Anderson's time on the council, but I would not be surprised in the least if you followed it. You know, really this was trying to, if you recall, put together a proposal to make this sort of a financially viable model to step in where we anticipated there would be some community need around partial day or partial week childcare to complement the school's hybrid reopening plan. And so, you know, it was a proposal and an initiative that came together very quickly to try to fill that gap. And we used, you know, numbers to the best of our ability with a new facility that we had no familiarity with. We based it on some, you know, a number of kind of community surveys of people in the program, in our childcare programs, to find out what their need and what that use might be. And so for the purposes of this evening, what we've done is we've tried to tie the initial numbers for comparative purposes to the pro forma that we last discussed at the council level, which, you know, obviously had sort of, as we try to keep the cost centers consistent. So part-time staffing, supplies, materials, lease, utilities, property management, fit up, you know, even though it's really only been 3 months since our last conversation, we've learned a lot along the way. What you'll see here, this 90,020.50 figure is what, using just the pro rata or prorated portion of the pro forma, where we thought we could be. And again, this was our best attempt. What you'll see obviously is that we haven't spent to date, again, this is just a 10-week period, so this is a snapshot. We haven't spent to date what we thought we might. Part of that is just adjusting, you know, once we got into the facility, what those needs were. Part of that was accessing some grant funding, which we'll talk about, the CRF grant. So that's certainly good news. what we also have tapped into, as we kind of anticipated we might, tapped into using some full-time staff to supplant, and in this case, really stand in for a lack of part-time childcare direct support. So, the part-time line up here not only covers some direct childcare expenses, staffing expenses, but also janitorial, some other facility-based needs that we had. So this 16,640 figure, I just want to highlight, is a figure that represents the use of, again, approximately the use of full-time staff at a part-time staff rate. So it's not the actual, we didn't blend or calculate roughly the 130 hours per week of full-time staff are using in the place of part-time staff, or have had to use in place of part-time staff. Is simply trying to quantify what that part-time expense would have been had we been able to fill all those shifts and needs with part-time staff, if that makes some sense. So again, we do want to try to quantify that so we can get an idea of what the actual expense or closer to the actual expense for running the operation is. The reality is that this $16,000 figure to date is already funded or appropriated in the budget. You could probably have a conversation about, and again, COVID has necessitated a change to the programmings we've done and put on and offered, but that's probably where there's not a quantified impact in this conversation, because all these programs that the full-time staff are not providing because they're doing their needs are being met, or their attention is being taken away and applied to the hybrid daycare. That's a gap that we're not really representing on this page. So we tried to quantify what the pro forma suggested we'd be at from an expense standpoint, where we actually stand for expenses. And then the third column here is where we, again, best guess, where we project we will be at the end of the hybrid daycare model. Again, presuming it's another 28 weeks, so sort of 38 weeks or 10 weeks at the beginning, 28 to get us through the middle of June, presuming that's when school ends. We not obviously, but we did talk about using this facility for our summer camp, which would be additional expense and revenue model. We're setting that aside for the time being. We just want to look at how this might look at the end of it.
And where is all the expenses to get the property up and in shape? There were quite a few modifications that had to be made. There was a lot of moving expenses, I would assume. I mean, I know we absorbed some of that just internally, but what was the bottom line of what it costs to outfit that whole facility?
We put in the budget $45,000 for the fit up. Again, not really knowing what we could reuse or borrow from the school department, what we would obtain from grant funding. So that fit up cost, again, is a pro rate, essentially 10 weeks of $45,000. This is what we've actually spent to date, $6,864. Keep in mind that some of those expenses, and again, this is where it's the challenge. We didn't anticipate representing what the grant would do for those expenses.
And can I ask one more question before we get to the grant? So was the fit up, did that include moving the community services department, or has some of that expense been put somewhere else, like in the community services budget? Because I know when we did this, I did not understand. I'm not sure it was specifically, and I could have just missed it, but that the whole department was actually moving over there, which makes sense. But there was more than just, there was more that you would think, not everybody's desk would have to move, not everybody's computer. It makes sense why it happened, but is this a fit up for the entire thing of what happened, including the community services move, or is there another budget somewhere related to community services that included their move over there?
Nope. This captures all of our expenses to date for that purpose. We haven't
everything. So
yeah, I mean, keep in mind that we have a fairly active department,
right?
And so we didn't hire a moving company. If you've been up, and I'm sure you have, Councilor Gleistine, to where the third floor office space they had,
right.
It was probably all of 300 square feet, 400 square feet. So not a lot of stuff. A lot of their desks. There was some procurement of some new office furniture for some of the staff. Again, that was out of the grant funding. And then again, the benefit to having a robust internal IT department is that we're not, that's kind of rolled into the upfit of the technology needs required to do the hybrid daycare. So really minimal, in the grand scheme of things, minimal expense attributed to the relocation of the staff. I guess the other thing I would just say about that, and I know that there's been quite a lot of conversation, again, I expect Councillor Anderson can speak to this in his work as liaison, but the staff there have really stepped up tremendously to fill that void of part-time staff. Not
Right, and it wouldn't have been possible if they weren't there.
It would not have been possible to meet the
They
needs.
wouldn't have been able to do it.
Correct.
The secondary benefit of clearing them out of this building, one, there really wasn't a need. I mean, other than passports, which they're conducting at that location, there's really no need for the public to come to their counter anymore. They can transact all their business there, but it gave us the ability to actually relocate some of the IT staff on a very temporary basis upstairs so they could be distant and continue to safely come to work. So it's really a multi-benefit to us. Freeing up space here gave us the ability to kind of spread out a little more. And
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yep.
And there's not a staff member, including the director, who's not or hasn't put in a shift managing or supervising a hybrid pod or co.
Right.
So tremendous group effort.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry, you can talk about the grant again. I'm sorry.
no, that's okay. So just taking it down. So revenues, again, we had, I think at this point, safe to say, a very optimistic number. That number originally was based on full enrollment and a week or two earlier than we ultimately were able to start providing care. So just from we got into the building on September 23rd. We didn't actually start daycare, providing care until October 5th. That was sort of the transition period. And it was predicated upon having 40 kids enrolled Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and having those sort of separate cohorts, if you will, both in the building on Wednesday for 80. So essentially 240 kids at $50 a day. And I'll show you momentarily where we see that enrollment going. Needless to say, we haven't met those figures. So that's part of the reason why there's been, so that combined with a later start is the reason for the really significant discrepancy in revenues. 120,000 based on that. Here's where we're at. And again, there's some other caveats that I'll get into here about why that figure is what it is. So while expending is certainly less than what we expected, our revenues are also more so down. And so that kind of puts us about right now as it stands, or at least the first 10 weeks, in the hole. Now, again, not to have a sort of final conversation about all the other pieces in place, but there is some reassurance or some insurance on any negative deficit from a private benefactor. So there are some things that ultimately, once we have a full reconciliation of this project, that will hopefully minimize any out-of-pocket expense to the municipality. Again, premature to have that conversation, but I would make that note. In terms of the projections here, before we get down to the grant, again, this is our best guess. That 50,400 part-time staffing line is really, again, our part-time payroll expense has varied from $1,600 to $2,200 a week. So that's based on $1,800 a week for the remaining 28 weeks. Again, this is Director Souza's best guess in terms of program supplies and materials. We've been able to purchase a lot of those for the year. The lease is probably the one that's most straightforward, right? We know what that lease expense is going to be, including our portion of the taxes. It does not include the $14,000 deposit, which we expect to be returned ultimately if and when the lease is discontinued. But these figures are really coming from Todd and what he projects out based on what he knows. I think at this point, if you recall our pro forma and our larger conversation, the conservative approach to calculating this was that schools would go red and we'd have no revenue and minimal staffing expense for the springtime. Again, indications are that we're probably going to continue in a hybrid format. for the foreseeable future. So, it's going to be something that, in addition to quarterly updates, to the degree this committee wants to have a check-in either on a monthly basis or every other month, I expect these figures to continue to move both, from a revenue standpoint and expense standpoint to some degree. One other just quick thought.
I don't think we'll need a monthly update. I don't know if that would be helpful, honestly, but I think if there's something going on with the program or really anywhere else in town that is of interest or you think would be of interest to us, then absolutely, please bring it to us during our monthly meeting. But I think forecasting financials for a short-term program every month is probably a lot of work with not a ton of benefit. We're projecting to lose 6,000 for the year. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, if all those figures are accurate, which again will be, and again, that's 6,000 for the end of the hybrid care program. Again, we haven't taken into consideration both the revenue and expense associated with an additional summer camp program. That's another kind of component, the summer component, if you will.
And it's a one-year lease. You haven't had any discussions or thoughts about extending. They're still marketing the building, right?
Not to my knowledge. I'm not aware of any further discussions.
No, there have been no discussions, and the property's still on the market. I'm not aware that they've shown it since we've had occupancy, but they certainly are free to.
Okay.
So I guess just quickly, and then I'll wrap up. And the CRF grant was something that came forward and was approved. This was, I believe, the grant that with the school department's assistance we were able to obtain. We fully expect we'll exhaust all of the $59,000 in funds. You will see this 13,840 figure reflected as a revenue here and directly offsets the expense for part-time staffing. And so this one, again, stay tuned for, but I have no reason to believe, and neither does Todd, that we are not going to utilize all of these funds. How these funds have offset or reduced some of our other expenses, again, I didn't go into that level of detail, but undoubtedly this $59,000, the majority of it would otherwise have been become a local responsibility.
That's great.
Just quickly, for whatever it's worth, this is sort of a run through. And again, this just went through November 30th. So you can see kind of where our enrollments are going. I think just for the committee's, consideration, there are a lot of moving pieces here. We have some people join, we have other people drop off. So this isn't, where you see the average go from 25 up until the 35 we expect it to be. That's not, those same 25 aren't still here. We have had some turnover. Again, I can't get into all the reasons. Another reason for the shortfall in revenue, because if you extrapolate out, 35 or 138 essentially student days, if you want $50 a day, it won't equate. We have some kids on scholarship. We have some that DHHS is providing funding for. There's other sort of reasons like that where the revenue that I gave or represented, the 47,000, was what has been received to date. There's still some outstanding payments due that will increase those figures. But it's I guess the other thing I just point out, which I haven't had a discussion with Todd about, but there was a federal piece of legislation passed in the spring which provided some paid leave in the event of school and daycare closures pertaining to COVID. At the current time, that's going to expire at the end of the calendar year. So there could very well, in terms of need, be an increased need after the first of the year related to parents having to go back to work, no longer being able to take advantage of that employer paid leave. So we do have capacity, which is the good news. And we're trending in the right direction in terms of enrollment.
Any questions for Leo?
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, Leo, I was really proud of community services staff for being able to pull off this program so quickly and provide the service to our residents. I think it's really impressive. So anyways, kudos to the team. And it looks like the financials are going to come pretty close to a wash.
Yeah, I think that's well, obviously we'd not be so close, but I think ultimately we'll be okay. I think the other thing I just shared, again, it's anecdotal, but I have heard that some of the feedback the teachers have had are that the kids kind of attending our hub daycare, in some instances, are outperforming those otherwise left to their own devices without that structure. So I think that there's also been a positive learning impact as well.
Is there a concerted effort to try and still get some of that part-time staff to allow the full-time staff to kind of focus on their core work? And is that projected to kind of hopefully happen in the next quarter, or where are we on that? Because I know, like you had mentioned, Liam, Todd's team has really done a phenomenal job rallying and doing things that they probably didn't think they were ever going to have to do. And, watching kids can, it's definitely a calling for some folks. And so I'm just curious what you think is going to happen there.
We continue to actively recruit. Keep in mind that when we ran the initial kind of hiring campaign, a lot of things were still up in the air in the fall. Whether kids were going to go to college, whether they're going to be home. There's still a lot of apprehension around getting back in the workforce. I will say that we've done a recent string of hiring. I think that we're 2 or 3 or 4 positions up just over the last 4 weeks than where we were. We also right now are taking advantage of some college kids that are home. So that's given the full-time staff, a bit of a reprieve. It's our hope that we will continue to actively recruit and reduce the burden, I guess, if you will, on the full-time staff. But to a person, they understand these are unprecedented times. I think that they've really all stepped up and they get it. But yes, the hope is, to answer your question, that we will have a more robust inventory of part-time staff.
And I think Todd said this was opened up outside of Scarborough for kids, right?
I believe that we are, I believe because, obviously that initial pecking order was really to make sure we prioritized, obviously local residents, kids that are currently in the program, local students of local residents and in the school system, then staff. I believe at this point we're open to enrollments from anyone who has a need.
Right. And has there been a Leader article? Did they get featured in the Leader?
I know that there's been some publicity, at least at the onset. I don't know, Councillor Gleistein, if we've done any recent promotion on it. I know that social media we have been. We've been highlighting both the need for staff as well as some availability for care. I certainly can check in on find out what the last article or piece was we did.
Yeah, it would be good if it got featured again so that town residents would. Well, and I suppose, did the school ever do an email blast to let parents know it was available? So that would be the biggest way to get the Scarborough students. So, okay. All right.
Any other questions for Liam?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last item on our agenda is just a quick update on the annual audit report. And I just added this so that I could get a better understanding for where we are with that process.
So per usual, we're behind, but more so as a result of COVID than just being behind. But the goal now is to try and have it out by the end of January. And I guess we're going to have to wait and see how things go. We keep getting pulled away. I know the school's still in the process of finalizing their work. We're still in the process of trying to do our work. The auditors have been in and out. They're trying to be safe and away because of the COVID. So there's a lot more online transferring of data and things. So it's just been a little difficult to try and get the work processed and done. But we still work on it and we're still trying.
For what the presentation last year, Tom?
I believe it was, I can check. I think it was the second week of February.
Okay.
So, we always certainly strive to do it before budget, and we certainly will be able to do that. If there's any consolation, I have talked to the auditor. He has confirmed that all of his public sector clients are kind of lagging this year. So we're not alone. And we're certainly cognizant of the fact that the charter suggests, actually requires that the audit be presented to you by the end of December. So we're going to be over that. Maybe that's a point, Councillor Gleifstein, that we should talk about because we're consistently challenged by making that deadline, more so this year. But in spite of all that, you'll have it comfortably and presented in sometime mid-February at the latest.
Okay. Any questions on the annual audit? Okay. Thank you for that update. I don't believe there's any members of the public that have logged in. Liam, can you confirm?
I can confirm. No one's in attendance.
Well, for everybody watching on YouTube anyways, hello. And that brings us to our final item, which is to adjourn. Tom? No, okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved?
Moved. Second.
Colette?
Okay, Counselor Clucci,
Yes.
Counselor Anderson,
Yes.
Counselor Gleifstein.
Yes.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank
everybody.
you.
Punctuality. I like it.
Yeah, right on the minute.
Good start, John.